The smuggled crocodile panic. On August 25, 2010, Filaire L410 turboprop departed Bandundu, Democratic Republic of the Congo, bound for Kinshasa. The aircraft was operating a short domestic route with 20 people on board, including crew. Before the incident, the flight was routine. The aircraft was lightly loaded, weather conditions were acceptable, and climb performance was normal. No mechanical issues were reported after takeoff. The triggering moment occurred minutes into the flight when a small crocodile, illegally smuggled inside a passenger's duffel bag, escaped into the cabin. The primary trauma began with sudden passenger panic. As the animal moved inside the confined cabin, multiple passengers rushed forward simultaneously, attempting to escape toward the cockpit. Small turboprop aircraft are highly sensitive to abrupt center of gravity shifts. Rapid movement of mass toward the nose can exceed controllable pitch limits almost instantly. The pilots remained conscious and attempted recovery. Control authority was lost as the aircraft pitched sharply downward. There was no time to stabilize. The aircraft crashed into a residential area shortly after departure. 19 people died from impact trauma. Death resulted from loss of control caused by sudden cabin weight shift triggered by an illegally transported animal. The illegal gasoline carry-on. On August 22, 1999, Uni Air Flight 873 was preparing to land at Taipei Songshan Airport after a routine domestic flight. The McDonnell Douglas MD-90 carried over 90 passengers. Before the incident, the flight was uneventful. Cabin conditions were normal. No warnings or mechanical abnormalities had been reported during cruise. The triggering moment originated in the overhead compartment. A passenger had packed 2 plastic bottles filled with gasoline as carry-on luggage. Another passenger had placed a motorcycle battery in the same bin. The primary trauma mechanism began when the aircraft descended and cabin movement shifted the contents. The battery terminals arced, producing a spark inside the confined overhead space. Clinically, gasoline vapors ignite instantly when exposed to electrical discharge. In enclosed environments, combustion becomes explosive rather than flammable. Passengers were conscious when the explosion occurred. Flames erupted inside the cabin ceiling. Smoke spread rapidly, overwhelming nearby occupants before evacuation could be completed. The aircraft landed immediately. One passenger later died from severe burns and inhalation injuries. The death resulted from thermal trauma caused by prohibited hazardous materials carried into the cabin and stored together without containment. The drug mule overdose. On October 3, 2006, Iberia Flight 602 departed Bogotá, Colombia, bound for Madrid, Spain, on a transatlantic route. Among the passengers was an individual acting as an internal drug courier, carrying multiple packets of high-purity cocaine concealed inside the body. Before the incident, the passenger appeared outwardly normal. They remained seated, spoke little, and slept intermittently during cruise. No visible distress was noted by cabin crew or nearby passengers. The triggering moment occurred silently inside the body. One of the latex-wrapped cocaine packets ruptured within the gastrointestinal tract, releasing its contents directly into surrounding tissue and bloodstream. The primary trauma mechanism was acute cocaine toxicity. Unlike ingested drugs, absorption was immediate and uncontrolled, bypassing metabolic safeguards that normally limit dosage. Clinically, massive stimulant exposure overwhelms the cardiovascular system. Heart rhythm becomes chaotic. Body temperature rises rapidly, and oxygen demand spikes while respiratory control degrades. The passenger lost consciousness without warning. There was no outward struggle, agitation, or request for help. The individual appeared to fall asleep in the seat. Medical intervention was not possible until landing. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Death resulted from sudden cardiac and respiratory failure caused by internal rupture of smuggled narcotics at altitude. The blind landing bet. On October 20, 1986, Aeroflot Flight 6502 was approaching Kuramac Airport near Kuibyshev in the Soviet Union. The Tupolev Tu-134 carried 94 passengers on a routine domestic flight during daylight conditions. Before the incident, the aircraft was fully functional. Weather was stable. Instrumentation was reliable. The approach required no unusual maneuvering or technical skill beyond standard procedure. The triggering moment occurred inside the cockpit. The captain claimed he could land the aircraft using instruments alone. Curtains were drawn across the cockpit windows, eliminating all forward visibility as part of a wager with the first officer. The primary trauma mechanism developed through deliberate disregard of warning systems. Ground proximity alarms activated repeatedly as the aircraft descended too rapidly. Air traffic controllers issued urgent corrections as descent rates exceeded safe limits. The aircraft remained controllable until impact. The failure was cognitive, not mechanical. Human decision-making overrode every redundant safety layer designed to prevent terrain collision. Passengers were fully conscious. The descent felt normal until the final seconds. There was no time to process what was happening before impact. The aircraft struck the runway short of the threshold at approximately 170 miles per hour. 70 people died from catastrophic blunt force trauma caused by controlled flight into terrain. The kid at the controls, on March 23, 1994, Aeroflot Flight 593 was cruising at altitude over Siberia en route from Moscow to Hong Kong. The Airbus A310 carried 75 passengers and crew. Before the incident, the aircraft was stable in cruise. Autopilot was engaged. Weather was calm. No operational input was required from the flight crew. The triggering moment occurred when the captain invited his 15-year-old son into the cockpit and allowed him to sit in the pilot's seat. The child applied force to the control column. The primary trauma mechanism involved partial autopilot disengagement. The system silently transitioned into a degraded mode without a clear auditory alarm, reducing automatic stability while still appearing active. Partial automation failures are dangerous because pilots assume full system authority remains. Control feedback becomes misleading, masking the developing loss of stability. The aircraft slowly rolled and entered a spiral dive. The pilots remained conscious but confused, struggling to understand why control inputs felt ineffective. As speed increased, structural limits were exceeded. The aircraft broke apart in midair. All 75 people died from impact trauma. The wing walk stunt. In October 2018, a small Cessna 172 lifted off from a private airstrip in British Columbia. It was a short, low-altitude flight intended to film a music video. On board were a pilot and influencer John James, who planned to perform a mid-air stunt for the camera. Before the incident, the aircraft was marginally within operating limits. Fuel load was high, the cabin was occupied, and the aircraft's performance envelope left little excess margin. Weather conditions were calm, and the flight plan was simple. The triggering moment occurred after climb-out. James exited the cabin and stepped onto the wing strut without a safety tether. His movement shifted mass away from the aircraft's center of gravity while the plane was still accelerating. The primary trauma mechanism developed through asymmetric loading. The sudden lateral weight shift altered lift distribution across the wings, increasing drag on one side and inducing an uncommanded roll. Clinically, light aircraft are highly sensitive to balance changes. At low altitude, recovery from a developing roll or spin requires immediate correction and vertical space that may not exist. James was conscious as the aircraft began to bank. Grip strength failed as airflow increased and the wing angle changed. He lost hold and fell. He died from fall impact injuries. The aircraft landed shortly afterward. The death resulted from deliberate destabilization of a light aircraft during flight. The $12 light bulb obsession. On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was descending toward Miami over the Florida Everglades. The Lockheed L-1011 carried 176 passengers and crew. Before the incident, the aircraft was operating normally. Autopilot was engaged. Weather was clear. The only issue was a landing gear indicator light that failed to illuminate. The triggering moment occurred when all three cockpit crew members fixated on the faulty bulb. Each leaned forward to troubleshoot the indicator rather than monitoring flight instruments. The primary trauma mechanism began when the control yoke was inadvertently nudged. This disengaged the autopilot's altitude hold mode without a prominent warning. Slow, unrecognized descent is one of aviation's most dangerous states. The aircraft remained stable while quietly losing altitude. Passengers and crew remained conscious and unaware. Conversations continued. No one noticed the gradual descent into terrain. The aircraft struck the Everglades at cruising configuration. 101 people died from blunt force trauma. The crash resulted from task fixation on a trivial problem, while basic flight monitoring was abandoned. The ghost flight. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 departed Cyprus bound for Prague. The Boeing 737 carried 121 people. Before the incident, the aircraft was airworthy. Maintenance had been performed earlier that day. The triggering moment occurred on the ground. The cabin pressurization switch was left in manual mode after testing. The primary trauma mechanism developed gradually. As altitude increased, cabin pressure failed to rise. Clinically, hypoxia causes confusion, impaired judgment, and loss of consciousness without panic. The pilots misinterpreted warning alarms as takeoff configuration alerts. cognitive function degraded silently. All occupants lost consciousness. The aircraft continued on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. The plane crashed near Athens. Everyone on board died from hypoxic incapacitation followed by impact. The self-medicated alcohol mix. On December 14, 2015, Qantas Flight 94 departed Los Angeles International Airport bound for Melbourne, Australia. Among the passengers was an adult traveler with a documented fear of flying who had prepared for the long-haul flight by self-medicating. Before the incident, the passenger was awake but visibly sedated. Cabin crew observed slurred speech and heavy drowsiness, though the passenger was still responsive to basic questions and assistance. The triggering moment occurred several hours into cruise. Prescription sedatives taken before boarding combined with large quantities of alcohol consumed after departure. At cabin altitude, the physiological effects intensified beyond ground-level expectations. The primary trauma mechanism was central respiratory suppression. The combined depressant load acted directly on the brainstem centers responsible for maintaining breathing rhythm. Clinically, alcohol significantly amplifies the effects of benzodiazepines and similar sedatives at altitude. Reduced oxygen pressure further worsens hypoxia, slowing respiratory drive without triggering distress. The passenger lost consciousness quietly. Breathing became shallow, irregular, and then ceased without external signs of struggle. The aircraft continued to destination. The passenger was pronounced dead after landing. Death resulted from sedative and alcohol-induced respiratory failure in a hypoxic cabin environment. The overfueling guess. On September 3, 1989, Varig Flight 254 departed Marabá, Brazil, bound for Belém. The Boeing 737 carried 54 passengers and crew. Before the incident, the aircraft was airworthy. Navigation systems were functional. The flight plan required a simple heading input. The triggering moment occurred when the pilots entered an incorrect heading into the flight computer. Instead of 027 degrees, they entered 270 degrees, sending the aircraft west. The primary trauma mechanism involved navigational error, compounded by inattention. Instead of recognizing geographical inconsistencies, the pilots monitored a football match on the radio. Fuel exhaustion accidents develop slowly. Warning signs appear hours before engines fail. Passengers remained conscious as fuel levels dropped. Engines flamed out sequentially over the Amazon rainforest. The aircraft crashed during a forced landing attempt. 13 people died. The accident resulted from basic navigational error ignored for hours due to distraction and assumption. The selfie disorientation. On May 31, 2014, a small Cessna 150K lifted off from the Front Range Airport in Watkins, Colorado. The aircraft carried a pilot and one passenger. Before the incident, the plane was stable. Weather was clear. Engine performance was normal. The flight relied entirely on visual references in darkness. The triggering moment occurred inside the cockpit. The pilot and passenger began taking photographs using a smartphone. The camera flash fired repeatedly in the unlit cabin. The primary trauma developed through flash blindness. The pilot's night-adapted vision was overwhelmed, eliminating reliable perception of the horizon. Spatial disorientation occurs when the inner ear provides false orientation cues in the absence of visual reference. Control inputs often worsen the error. The pilot remained conscious but unaware of the developing stall. Airspeed decayed while altitude decreased. The aircraft entered an unrecovered stall and struck the ground. Both occupants died from blunt force trauma. The crash resulted from loss of spatial orientation caused by deliberate distraction during night flight. A GoPro camera later recovered from the wreckage. The self-correction tragedy. On August 31, 1999, Lapa Flight 3142 was departing Buenos Aires on a scheduled domestic route. The Boeing 737 carried 100 passengers and crew. Before the incident, the aircraft was taxiing for takeoff. Systems were functional. No mechanical failures were present. The triggering moment occurred when the pilots failed to set the wing flaps for takeoff. The omission went unnoticed during checklist execution. The primary trauma mechanism developed during the takeoff roll. A loud configuration warning sounded, indicating unsafe takeoff parameters. Takeoff configuration warnings require immediate rejection of takeoff. Ignoring them removes the last margin for correction. The pilots assumed the alarm was faulty and continued accelerating. The aircraft failed to generate sufficient lift. The plane overran the runway and collided with construction equipment and buildings. 65 people died from impact and post-crash injuries. The accident resulted from ignored warnings and misplaced confidence in self-correction.